Hi, I'm Dana Martin, and I'm part of the team here at Worldwide Clinical Trials, a global full service CRO. This is the first in our new thought leadership platform and webinar series, To the Endpoint. This first discussion in our new series is moderated by Worldwide's President and co CEO, Peter Benton.
Thank you, Dana. Welcome, everybody, to the first of many pointed discussions in our To the Endpoint series, which is focused on bringing together thought leaders for a candid look at ways to jumpstart best practices on the bold new path forward in clinical research. My name is Peter Benton. I'm the President and co-CEO at Worldwide Clinical Trials. We're a global CRO offering clinical development solutions across all phases and ranges of therapeutic areas. Today, I'm joined by an expert panel to discuss how COVID-19 has forever changed the game for healthcare and clinical research, in addition to the other aspects of our lives. So before we get started, let's introduce our expert panel. We have Domingo Rodriguez, MD, Executive Vice President of Clinical Operations at Veru.
Hi, good afternoon or good morning, like Dana mentioned, depending on which geography you are at. My name is Domingo Rodriguez, EVP of Clinical Operations at Veru Pharmaceutical. I have been in the industry for about 35 plus years, the last 18 or so solely on clinical operations. And I have been involved in startups, mid-size and large pharmaceutical company. Veru is a small biotech company based in Miami, Florida, even though the majority of us, we are remote. And we focus solely on, mostly I would say, oncology, prostate cancer and breast cancer. Thank you.
We're also joined by Lori Halloran, founder, president, and CEO of Halloran Consulting Group.
I've been in the industry for more years than I want to admit. I was a nurse and I've worked at a CRO for 10 years and then in biotech for 4 years. And when I worked in biotech, I realized that little biotech companies that were just getting started really needed expert help to sit around their table. So I founded my company to work with little companies early on, kind of two guys in a molecule. Right now we have over 140 full-time employees, and we work with, I like to say we have a bigger pipeline than Pfizer because we actually do. We have a couple hundred clients. Over the pandemic, we really got into the helping small, medium, and large companies adopt technology. So it's really exploded our business practice around helping sponsors become more technologically savvy. And that's what we'll talk about today.
And to round out the group, we have Craig Lipset, founder of Clinical Innovation Partners. Craig, can you share a little bit about yourself and your background?
Hi, Peter. Thanks so much for having us here today. So my name is Craig. I was recently at Pfizer. I was the head of clinical innovation, but today I split my time as an advisor, an educator, and occasionally a board member. I work together with pharma and biotech and investors and tech companies around innovation in clinical trials. I'm the vice chair of the board for the MedStar Health Research Institute, the vice president at the Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research, an advocacy group, and I'm the co-chair for the Decentralized Trials and Research Alliance.
So again, fantastic panel today. Thank you all for joining us. Now let's go ahead and get to the point. As we know, COVID-19 has more clearly defined our priorities and has expanded our capacity for innovation. As we look forward with hope to a resolution of this global crisis, we have an unprecedented opportunity to explore new and best practices on the revolutionary new path to clinical research. So let's go ahead and get started with question number one. What are some of the most valuable adaptations to emerge from COVID? I'll start with Lori on this question.
The biggest thing is that people recognized that we can't do things the old way because most clinical trials were simply in suspended animation. So we had to figure out how to get rid of our natural born risk aversion and think about the patients and getting the patients to the trials. What I would say we learned from that is that the FDA is open. They're actually encouraging us. We cannot do things the old way, and we really need to collaborate to get the trials moved forward into the patient-centric higher technological environment.
I think, Peter, about this past year that our biggest adaptation was our ability to embrace adoption. That so many of the strategies and approaches that we quickly embraced over the last year as a research community, they didn't require new regulations. They didn't require the FDA to lower any bars or thresholds. They didn't require technology to be created that wasn't previously available. In case after case, the story of the past year has been one of adopting approaches that had been available for us for some time. And so coming out of the pandemic, how do we continue to embrace that type of framework, that type of adaptability, so that we can be users of the approaches that are available to us and not have to wait for another crisis to create a step change in adoption?
If I can do a little plug, Craig came along at the best time with his affiliated organization, DTRA, where we all needed to learn together, and many minds are better than one. So we joined right away.
DTRA, if you're not familiar, the Decentralized Trials and Research Alliance is a nonprofit multi-stakeholder collaboration. You can tell I've said this before. A nonprofit multi-stakeholder collaboration that's exclusively focused on the global, removing barriers to the global adoption of decentralized research. The organization has about 120 members organizations, and that includes the FDA, top pharma and biotech companies, all the major tech companies and large CROs, but also critical other allies that are helping to make study execution happen, like the Halloran Consulting Group, advocacy groups, and so many other partners.
Domingo, so how about from a sponsor's perspective, what did you see as the most valuable things to change and emerge from COVID-19?
Yeah, so I think that Lori mentioned, I mean, the tools, they have been there for a while. And I think that when the FDA put the guidance with regards to COVID, everybody was like, oh my gosh, this is something new. When in reality, things, they have been said they are, for a while. So from the sponsor point of view, I can tell you that we need to start looking at things with a different set of lenses now. That COVID is a little bit behind us. So the other thing is that, unfortunately, and trying to push this, up the ladder to CEOs, et cetera, the flexibility was forced to us, because of the COVID pandemic. So it's not like we went there like, oh yeah, we want to be here. It was kind of like forced, but that also has opened the door because, a lot of, and I talked to a lot of the sponsors, they are saying, well, this worked. So can we now look at this more seriously? And I think that, it was forced, but now people, they have a little bit more of an open mind.
No, thank you. Thank you all. No, and I'm old enough to remember, paper case report forms, and I remember how long it took us to get to eClinical technologies, and as an industry, how slow we are to move. And one of the things as we were preparing for this, all of the things we said we couldn't do. We can't do remote audits. We can't have people remotely go monitor sites. All of the there were way more things that we couldn't do that all of a sudden overnight and immediately we had to figure out how to go do. And so, this has certainly forced us to make that change. So how can sponsors support ongoing innovation? We were forced to innovate, forced to adapt to some of those innovations. How can sponsors support ongoing innovation, both internally and in their external partnerships, to make sure that these changes are both smart for the long haul and that they're sustainable for the long haul? And why don't we start with you, Domingo?
Thank you, Peter. So I think that, everything starts from the beginning with trust, and trust from both parties. And I think that if you go to question one also that we had about why people were not going, for example, with remote monitoring, etc., it's all about trust on both sides and understanding, and also what is the level of risk averse, that both parties studies they have in here, with innovation. And by the way, innovation is a must. Innovation, we all going to have to innovate. And with technology, things are changing at a much faster pace than even 5 years ago or 2 years ago. The other thing is clear expectations. And I think that sometimes, even all the way up, and I am talking from the sponsor point of view, at the RFP stage is like, what are the expectations? Who is going to do what? How are we going to do this or that? How much is going to cost, etc. But one of the things that we have with innovation and also moving forward in partnership is the expertise. Sometimes you have, lack of expertise in one side or the other, and the expertise is a must, for both ends. And not only from, for example, the CRO, the sponsor point of view or side, is also with the subcontract. There are a lot of pieces that they are moving when you are running the trials. And again, things are changing tremendously. So I think that sometimes one of the frustrating points with the sponsor is when we start with, the races and the checklists and this and that and the other thing, they are old and they are not new. And we have to adapt, with that. Talking about that, both sides, the sponsors, vendors, CROs, subcontractors, everybody needs to be really flexible and have a sense of urgency when it comes to everything that is coming with all the innovations that they are coming down the pipe, and to keep everybody, sustainable.
I love the words trust, and I love the words flexible, and yet, the sense of urgency. So some really good perspectives. Ori, how about your customers and collaborators? You see a wide swath of the industry.
I think the first thing I would say in our experience was that the companies that had buy-in from the top and right at the C-level, that we have to do things differently, we're going to support you through this, adopted a more technological support approach right from the beginning. If the development team has to push it up, it's going to be harder. And the second thing I would say is that in many companies that don't have a head of clinical innovation, that's most of them, when they don't really have a team who's been there and done it, and don't necessarily have the ability to support massive change, the development team has to get a little bit more comfortable with getting help, defining what they need to do, going back to their principles of if it's validated and you have processes and things like that, you're going to have to give it a try, and you're going to have to almost package it to sell it to your executive team and to all of your collaborators. So the development team themselves inside the company has to be a champion and know that you're going to learn together, and you're going to have to really be transparent in your planning and in your timeline and what your checks are going to be, and double checks. And because the executive team almost always is worried about the overall development timeline. So development team themselves have to have a good idea of what that's going to look like. And they might have to invest a little more time up front, but they'll probably get a whole lot more quality and rapid data collection at the back end.
Yeah, and if I can chime in from the sponsor point of view, I agree with Lori. I think that sometimes, operations, product development, innovation, and it depends, the size of the company. My company, for example, I wear different hats. I cannot compare myself to Pfizer, Glaxo, one of the big pharmas, where you have all the different departments. But if you don't push it upwards, and if you cannot justify it also the end game, and it's what Lori is saying, maybe it's going to take a little longer to set things up, maybe it's going to cost a little bit more to set things up at the beginning, but we cannot lose that what we are after is when we cross the end line, and that is the point.
It's an investment that will ultimately pay off. A while ago, I did a program with development heads to create a business case for adopting technology, because most senior people in clinical development really don't know how to do that. So they had to have help with figuring out what it was going to cost, but ultimately what value it would bring. And that's a really big factor.
How about Craig? You see a much broader spectrum from the largest to the smallest biotechs in industry. Curious your perspective on how we make this sustainable.
Great points raised so far. Sometimes there isn't a clear ROI, right? Sometimes we have to do things and there has to be a little bit of a leap of faith there as well. And so I think it's important for organizations to try to have a diversified portfolio of non-drug initiatives, of innovation projects, just like they have a diversified portfolio of medicines or a diversified portfolio of investments at home. There are some things that maybe we want to stretch ourselves to do, and other things that may be far more incremental. I think that innovation is nothing without change management. Innovation is completely dependent on our ability to embrace good principles related to change management. And so much of that we've been talking about. People want to see top-down leadership and top-down buy-in, but we don't want to lose the opportunity of bottom-up momentum, right? I remember the first time implementing electronic consent inside of Pfizer, and leadership had said, yes, we shall anoint 2 or 3 teams that you can work with as to start that work. But what we didn't appreciate was how many other teams, so those teams put their head down and said, yeah, the boss says we have to do e-consent, so I guess we're doing e-consent. And what I didn't appreciate at that time was the power of the other teams in our organization that wanted to use e-consent. They were knocking on the door saying, how come those guys get to use e-consent and I don't? And so we made room for them, this bottom up kind of movement. And those were the teams that made it work in the organization. Those were the teams that when we asked for feedback about what worked and what didn't, they had all the insights to share. They wanted to be there. And every organization, large and small, has that distribution curve. We all have some people in our organization that want nothing to do with any of this. We have a lot of people in the organization that will do it if it's safe and if it's supported, but we all have some people in our organization that want to be on the leading edge and want to embrace these newer approaches. So top down, make sure people feel they have protection and cover. Bottom up, leverage and harness that right edge, that leading edge that every organization has. And remember, the success, the make or break of this is the same as change management for anything else we want to do. It's funny, people used to say, oh, we're going to do decentralized trials. And I'd say, well, here's a question. How did you implement your last ETMF? Oh, we hired a consulting firm and we put X number of FTEs on this and we gave it a X number of month process. And on this date, this was our switch date. That's how we manage change in our industry. There's commitment around it. We set milestones and we allocate resources against it. The place that innovation fails in our companies is when we expect innovation just to flourish based on volunteerism. That the only way that decentralized will happen in our company is if teams feel like working the midnight to 8 shift, finding new vendors, figuring out how to get them in the organization and supporting it all on their own. It's just not fair. Our study teams are busy. They're already working long hours. They need to know that there's support and capability around them. So those are at least some of my takeaways in terms of what we can do to make this work, to certainly fully embrace top down, to harness the people in our organizations that want to support change, but to make sure that they know that these things need support and resources. And without that, it's really not going to go anywhere.
One of the challenges, though, is, Craig, a lot of people don't have teams. They have 3 or 4 people. That's what's really challenging. So to have even your efforts where you're defining some really big things help people adopt, but they're busy heads down doing their day job, and they're going to have help doing that new thing. And it's easier to just go back and do the day job. I don't want it to end.
And to for those stakeholders, they know that they have to go outside of their 4 walls to do anything different or beyond the capacity that the N of 4 are able to do. They're squeezing and they're getting a ton done with a lean headcount for where they are, but they have to pull in resources from outside if they want to push any boundary in any direction. And so for those stakeholders, I think the same concepts apply. It's finding friends from outside of their walls rather than FTEs from within.
Yeah, but remember also, everything, like I said before, is not the cookie cutter approach, because you have different strategies and different goals from different companies. That is also to mandate, Craig and Lori, what, certain companies invest or do on all this. Yeah.
But Domingo, We're not that creative. We all see the same things out there. The winners in our space, in my opinion, tend not to be companies that are uncovering a strategy that no one else found. The winners are the ones that are able to actually adapt and embed in their organization, actually execute on those strategies.
100% about the adaptation. Agree.
I agree with you too. And the thing that I saw that was different during the pandemic was that people were willing to talk to each other about what they had done and help each other so that everybody didn't have to go back to square one. That was, to me, was the biggest thing that was instituted by the pandemic.
Lori, those weekly forums you were having, how many people would jump on that to share?
We started in March of 20, and we started off with 125 people. And within a week or two, we had people saying, can I bring somebody? Can I bring somebody? Its height, it was 275 people on a Zoom. It was amazing. And people really shared. I was just mind blown about it. It was great.
Let me, I just have got a couple points. We'll move to the next question. Just to agree with all of you. And it's amazing, so many people, even though as a CRO, we've done billions of dollars of research in many different areas. And sometimes we're listened to, and sometimes, people think they have the answers. COVID was an opportunity that no one had the answers and no one had any idea. And so the people that were interested in understanding what each and every other biotech or pharmaceutical company was doing was pretty intense. And again, and it changed. It changed daily. We were literally changing the understanding of the regulatory landscape. Every single day was changing as we went through this, and which deviations were in place to be able to continue to do research. The other thing is, I think the strategy you guys were talking about, and it was interesting because we had people in the middle, but there were sponsors who chose to sit it out and kind of wait and see what happens. And yet there were others that were very aggressive and very fast. And one of our sponsors chose to follow the virus, and we were implementing and spooling up sites in China as soon as the virus had kind of left China, was headed around the rest of the world. And so it's interesting to see the differences in strategies that people took. But to your point, no one had any idea what to do from a pandemic like this. We certainly had all talked about it, but no one ever really thought through the real life implications. So that brings us to our next question. How about successful examples of flexible study visit procedures that have a place in future research? That certainly was the biggest impacted area, the number of sites that were inaccessible, either with a human or sites that were unable to continue their research. So lots of things have changed in the last year. And Craig, why don't you talk about some of the new ideas and innovations that have come out of this?
I think the beautiful word in this question is that word flexible, because the beauty of decentralized trials is not just to take everything out of a clinic and slam it into people's homes. I think the beauty out of the approaches that are emerging today is to create flexibility and choice for research participants. Patients who participate in research actually overall like their experience, and that includes their experience at investigator sites. When you look at data from platforms like Trial Journey, the average rating of an investigator is a 4.4 out of 5. When you look at data from SysScript, patients overwhelmingly believe that they received the same or better care, and overwhelmingly would recommend research participation to a friend. And so the go forward solutions should not be, let's shut the door on sites and shove everything into people's homes. And quite honestly, that shouldn't be earth shattering to any of us, right? I used to like going to restaurants. I actually found DoorDash to be pretty cool. And going forward, I am going back into restaurants, but I'm not deleting the DoorDash app from my phone, right? I want to have choice in how I engage. That's how I'm engaging with the rest of my healthcare team. And that's how most participants would like to think about research. And so going forward, we're seeing more and more sponsors that are taking a hard look at their schedules in their protocols, looking at those visit schedules, and for each visit, identifying the choices, the options that can be made available for a participant in order to continue to capture high quality data, but in ways that can offer flexibility for the individual. Some visits will require a patient to come in. Some can be done using local labs, local imaging centers, phlebotomists or other home health professionals, use of video, use of remote monitoring technologies, a range of different options. Now, our challenge in order to realize that future state more broadly tends to be our endpoints, that we still have some endpoints, like say a 6-minute walk test, that will always force a person to come into a clinic, if only just to take a walk in the hallway between two 30-meter cones for 6 minutes. But as more and more sponsors are investing in digitizing those endpoints, and we're seeing more and more collaborations around that to help democratize that, so it's not just a privilege for the large pharma, but as we modernize these endpoints, we'll see even more opportunities to offer this type of choice and flexibility. If you want to go into the clinic for a visit, you should have that choice, and we should be opening as many doors for access and participation rather than opening some while closing others.
In the programs, so we basically went through every one of the programs that we were on, and only in the programs where there was a patient getting an infusion in a clinic was there no alternative for something at home. What we ended up doing was looking, as you said, Craig, at the schedule of events and identifying where you could have something that was available remotely versus the times when you couldn't do that. And then ultimately, I saw that a lot of companies would do a choose your own journey, where for the patients that really like to have the interaction with the research site, they could go in, especially if they weren't really worried about COVID. But obviously this will not hopefully be the impediment in the future. But the people who have really busy lives and don't want to drive or fly to the research site, when there is something that they can do that's telemedicine-like, or using the support of a central lab, I think that's gonna ultimately enable people who would be interested, but aren't willing to invest the hours of time in driving and spending their workday, navigating around a visit. I think that's really where there's a really big sweet spot to get some populations that would normally not participate. So I think that's huge. The challenge here is you've got to be ready for an inspection. So it's all of the preparation and all of the documentation so that when an inspection comes along, you haven't forgotten everything, so to speak.
And Domingo, how about your perspective? And obviously, you and the Veru team pivoted from even some of your targets into things you could do with COVID. So you were both operating under the pandemic and focused on treatments also. As you share some of your perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, we, like you said, Peter. I mean, we jumped from oncology into the pandemic. With one of our compounds on COVID, but going back to the flexibility, I think that Craig and Lori, they have mentioned pretty much everything that we did or we are doing, still doing, from changing from one day to another. And we did, the typical telemedicine, visiting nurses, et cetera, local labs, et cetera. And we went really quickly in terms of either changing the protocol and adapting the protocol, or note to files, whatever we needed to do to get things done. I mean, from our point of view, and my experience also is because we were dealing with such a sick patient population, even with COVID, oncology patients, they wanted to come into the office, so it was interesting to see this. So we had probably about a 10% or so of patients that they chose with telemedicine, or they didn't want to go and get their images on their scheduled visits because they were afraid of that. The rest, they did that. I spoke about the protocol. We changed the SOPs and the plans to update everything and be flexible. And also, we were very proactive with the regulatory agencies and discussed what we were doing, how we were going to do. We shared the protocols and all the changes. I think that one of the areas that Lori mentioned, and we cannot, move away, is the inspection. I mean, depending where you are on phase 2, phase 1B, phase 2, phase 3, the higher the number, the more that that is the possibility that the agency is going to knock on the door and what is going to happen. So the other piece of the puzzle that we are missing here are the clinical sides. And what is the investigator, comfortable doing? What is the study coordinator comfortable doing? So that is the other piece that we need to bring into the conversation. And from my position, I was on weekly contact with all the sites, all the investigators, on the phone to make sure that everybody was on the same page.
We found as a CRO, we needed to provide solutions. Laura, you were talking about infusions. We run everything from phase 1 to phase 4. And obviously, first in human patient trials, you can't really do those remotely. And so, we were impacted for a few weeks, but we were pretty much open throughout the pandemic and running, first in human trials, and obviously had to adjust our schedule accordingly. But there were things like the pulmonary function, pulmonary test, and again, previously, breathing into a machine, having people breathe into the same machine to take a test, maybe that was acceptable. Whether it was scientifically advised or not, there's no one in their right mind would possibly want to use any kind of breathing apparatus that some other person had been using. And so, we found ourselves having to adapt very quickly. We felt like we were part of the Apollo project, trying to get the astronauts back to Earth, and again, trying to figure out how to kind of create new equipment and new ways of testing so that we could continue to operate. So it was certainly a stressful and trying time, but it was fantastic, the kind of innovation and creativity that we saw from clinicians and our teams trying to move things forward. Let's go to the next question. What do people need to do to make recent departures from past processes the new normal for future studies, right? How do we make sure we really don't go back, that we're just going to continue to move forward? And I'm going to start with you, Lori.
Well, I honestly think that they really need to do a lessons learned on what they've learned, because they've certainly learned a lot over the last year, and have a company policy that they're going to adopt and integrate the things that have worked, and that they're going to make a commitment not to go back. What I know, because I know companies who are there, is that the technology actually exists at this time to go straight from the medical record right into the electronic database without any intervention really by human eyes. I know this to be true because there are companies doing it now. So I think we need to aspire to have that be the new normal. Because what monitors really should be doing is managing the compliance and the quality and the enrollment, instead of spending all of their time up to their eyeballs in data. And that's just, big opinion. Maybe not super PC, but it's a big opinion, because the monitors really should be, focused on the relationships instead of is the temperature 98.6 or 98.8. The data would be seamlessly gathered at a much lower cost and a much higher quality. So I'll just go be bodacious and go out there with that.
Fantastic.
I'm always being as bodacious as I can be.
Yeah. Well, Craig, why don't we switch to you? You've had a lot of bodacious ideas over time. So how do we make sure we're going forward and not back?
Well, first off, our path forward needs to conform to our minimum playbooks, right? And our minimum playbook is we can't compromise on data quality, data integrity, patient safety, right? These are the real guardrails around which we operate. Then there's all the fictional guardrails that we self-impose on ourselves because of organizational fear of change or comfort or whatever it may be. And so understanding where our real guardrails are versus the perceived guardrails. Nobody went to jail for doing the original remote trial 14 years ago. Nobody was fired. Nobody was hurt. So there are things we can do as long as we know what our real guardrails are versus the ones we self-impose. Collaborations, I think, right now are certainly key. There's so much opportunity that's growing and emerging for us to share our experiences in non-competitive ways, not only experiences through great conversations like this, Peter, that you and your team have put together, but opportunities to share data around those experiences. I know within DTRA, it's my belief that there's rich data that exists from what we've all done incrementally together. For example, we're often of the mindset that we can improve diversity with strategies like shifting location and decentralization, and maybe we can, but it doesn't happen just because we wish it to happen. There's data and evidence out there, and how can we best collaborate and share the data from our different experiences to raise all boats?
Domingo, how about from a sponsor's perspective? Any ideas?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that Craig and Lori bring good ideas, and I think, like, I have mentioned before, we all need to be and feel comfortable with the approach. And Craig mentioned nobody went to jail, and he is correct. And there were a couple of brave souls that they took that leap of faith. And Laurie mentioned the moving data directly from the electronic medical records into EDC, which the technology assists there. So I agree with all that, and I think that we need to be more risk averse and try to convince. We go back to CEOs and CFOs, etc., to talk about not all is about financials, and it's all about patient data. And I agree with Greg also, that is the data and safety at the end of the day is what moves everything. One of the things that I am very concerned, moving forward and with technology also, is because we are all patient-centric and we cannot do research without patients. So do patients have, the necessary technology to accomplish this? How much are we going to have to support that? Especially when we are in an era where we are trying to include more and more diversity, and that is super important for all these clinical trials. Are we going, or is everybody in the same playing field? So that is one thing that we need to look at.
I couldn't agree with you more, Domingo. I've been in a recent discussion around the patients that don't have an iPhone couldn't participate in some of the trials that we're sketching out. And that's a huge potential issue.
And I think, Laurie, that also falls on the sponsors, back and responsibility. And like I said, it's not all about financials. But again, a lot of education, a lot of pushback that we're going to have to do. And I truly believe that we're going to get there. And when we look back, to remote monitoring and, electronic ICFs and all that, and now everybody feels pretty comfortable with that. But it took us a while. Mm-hmm. I think that COVID pushed us. Mm-hmm. And like I said on my first, comments, it was because we were forced to, not because it was our choice.
There are some positives to this pandemic and pushing us to use these tools. I mean, Lori, I can remember doing pilots of pulling patient data directly into EDC, and that was 20 years ago. I mean, that was a long time ago, and lots of things have been possible. And was involved with Mitris and Craig and the Pfizer team long ago on big bold ideas, which were not bold ideas. Someone else, I think Lily did piloted some of these things even 25 years ago. It's taken us a long time to get there, but this crisis has forced us to confront that some of these things are possible, including the way we manage our teams. I mean, here we all are working from home, and some travel, some folks are traveling. I do go to the office often, but the way our employees have changed have probably forever changed. So,
Peter, if I may also, another point that I want to mention, I think, I don't remember if it was Craig or Lori that mentioned this, is the data sharing, socializing what we have. Again, Lori made the comment and gave the example of her forums and how it grew and everybody was sharing ideas. Unfortunately, we don't have that wide enough. And therefore, I think that is lack of knowledge or lack of data sharing or socializing data, etc., that also sometimes it helps us back.
That's why I'm as excited as I am about DTRA. It's opened up the major areas where we need to be able to share, and we need to be able to define and outline the change management, the education that has to happen. So I was an enthusiastic early participant, as Craig knows.
So let's go to question 4. Where should we be pushing the boundaries even further? How do we build upon what we've now proven is possible and make sure we don't go back? And I'm going to start with you, Craig.
That question is a great starting place, right? We know what is possible in our organizations now. Risk has been mitigated. We have done risk-based monitoring. We have done remote monitoring. We have enabled patients to participate from home, whether leveraging video or using local labs or local imaging centers. These things, the risk has been significantly reduced because at the heat of a pandemic, we aggressively forced ourselves to figure out how. And so now the risk is much lower for us to sustain that. But when we think about pushing ourselves, we shouldn't confuse the solutions of today with the solutions of tomorrow. I guess I've always enjoyed the idea of futurists and thinking about what's next. Years ago, we would think about mobile and using electronic consent, and maybe we started to think about things like trials taking place at home. These are not our future. These are our present. This is happening today. The FDA and global regulatory authorities have been speaking on behalf of these approaches for some time. The FDA is a founding member of the Decentralized Trials Alliance. So we shouldn't confuse when we're thinking about our strategies for the future and just say things like decentralized, because that isn't our future. That's our present. It's only rate limited by our willingness to adopt. There are exciting things that we can start to then envision about for the time beyond and think about how we stretch and map ourselves to those futures where participants have more choice, futures where research sites can make use of more of their own technology that they've invested in, futures where we're actually able to sustain diversity in our research studies, futures where we are actually able to launch more collaborative studies and master protocols than we've been able to date. I think there are exciting things that are ahead for us that we can look forward towards and start to build into our strategies while we're adopting and executing the solutions that we know are right in front of us today.
I agree with everything you've said, but there almost needs to be a traffic cop to make sure we don't go back in every company. There has to be a champion of a change, and individually, everyone who's here has to look at what they've done and say, let's learn from what we've done and let's move it forward and let's collaborate with others. Because I really still think that it comes down to a reluctance to take any risk and an aversion to change. That's what I see every day in the people that can't embrace new things. I also think we should make protocols a whole lot simpler. we try to pack every single thing into a protocol.
Mhm.
And you know, that becomes a catch-all for everything, which just makes it almost impossible to conduct. So don't go back at all. Choose the journey and get ready to have FDA be open. Pitch the change, pitch the protocol changes. As long as you have a rationale for why you're going to make a change and you're going to assure that they're going to still have the level of quality, they're probably going to go for it.
Recently on a call, sponsor suggested that we get USB drives and ship them to all the sites with a copy of the TMF. And so after spending all this money on this sophisticated, easy to use electronic trial master file, we're going to go keep copies on USB drives. And of course, my head wanted to explode and say, well, I'm not sure how you're going to keep all those up to date. But there's many things that we had to do in the past because there weren't tools available, because the technologies didn't exist. But now that they do, we still have the just natural tendency and desire to go backwards. We need to make sure we keep going forward. So, Domingo, how about you? Any?
I think that Lori and Craig, did an amazing job answering this question. I mean, we need to keep moving forward. I think that technology is changing super fast rate now. So I mean, 20 years ago it was changing. Now it's crazy with the AI and everything else that is out there. So we need to keep pushing. I think that one of the problems that we have, especially on the sponsor side, you look at my company. I use the expression, we are two cats and a dog, trying to run 7 trials, and you don't have time to do this, innovation, trying to push, trying to do research, trying to get more and more educated, because they are, we are working 24/7 and doing our day job, like we were mentioning before. But this is a great opportunity. Change is, it's going to be there, and we're going to need to adapt.
I was going to add a comment, but someone from the audience questioned Nick Labella from Zyversa Therapeutics. So Nick, fantastic comment question. Adaptive practices implemented in response to an emergency health declaration may or may not carry over to routine practice, right? I mean, and asking about our perspective on limitations of these new practices imposed in a post-COVID-19 world. And that was exactly my point. Is we have all of these temporary deviations and approvals in place. We've got to go change the regulations and make sure that doesn't hold us up. And as we all know, regulations are not a quick thing to go change. And so, I think to Nick's point, and I'm sure Craig, Domingo, Lori have some additional thoughts. Like, we've got to figure out a way to allow this to continue, right? I mean, I've certainly not seen any degradation in the integrity or value of the work that we're doing with these temporary approvals, and we need to figure out a way that we can continue to do so in the future.
Peter, I haven't necessarily seen, though, emergency health declarations that have changed or lowered the bar in terms of the adoption of these approaches in clinical research. We certainly saw, for example, here in the United States, that the adoption of telehealth and video visits needed to be catalyzed by a number of factors, right? Enabling fair reimbursement, removing interstate licensing barriers, lowering some of the HIPAA thresholds around the technology being used in the peak of the pandemic. We didn't see similar types of lowering the bar taken by the FDA or global regulatory authorities with many of the approaches that we as the research community had to adopt and embrace. And so while I think as a patient, it would be nice for my provider to be able to continue to use some of those same approaches, and I'm hoping that those are supported, for the research community, I don't know that we need significant regulatory change in order to sustain adoption. I'll even go a step further. My expectation is that with each regulatory approval that happens over the next 12 to 36 months, we're actually going to have another data point that supports the regulatory view of sustaining these approaches, because the studies that we're running during 2020 are getting submitted now and throughout the rest of this year and into early next. And so these are the studies that regulatory authorities around the world across therapeutic areas will be using to make decisions. And with each decision, it will be based on the merit of the molecule, but also validation of the methods of the study that were used to support that evidence. And so I don't know that we need a lot of new legislation. The FDA has indicated we can look forward to a guidance document on some of these issues in their peer, their PrEP document, their pandemic readiness plan. I'll drop the link for that in the chat if folks are interested. But, you know, I'll be curious what the others on the panel have to say.
I agree with you 100%. And as I said in my last comment, there are people already who are already doing this. They had invested in technology. They already had e-consent. They already had extractions so that the data was flowing directly into the electronic database on a daily basis. So I would say for anybody who's dipping their toe in the water, think through the rationale and demonstrate how you're going to continue to maintain the quality, and then pitch it. That's really what FDA is saying. There, as long as you have a documented rationale and you have assurance that the quality will stay at the level that needs to be for submission, the FDA is willing to entertain your proposals.
Let me weave in a question from Meryl Wiernick. In the process of implementing new technologies as quickly as possible, what are the challenges in getting QA on board when validation of a technology may not be as robust in the past, yet the risk is deemed acceptable? And Lori, I know you and I have talked about how quality is so critical and important in everything we do, and yet it can hold up the bus a lot of times. So.
I mean, you actually, the first time I ever talked to you, you called me up and said, how about we have a centralized like basically quality assurance for every CRO? Why aren't we doing that with all the technology companies? Why aren't we doing that where the technology, when it's been validated, there's a certification, so you don't have to go back and redo it every single time? I mean, it would be a huge benefit to the industry if we could just say, yes, they've met the bar. And maybe somebody else has a contrary perspective to say it has to be validated at another level, but I'd have to hear why.
I've worked for clinical technology companies before, and it's amazing the amount of sponsors that, you know, can't use either our technology solutions or even here as worldwide as CRO, like, hey, we'd love to use you, but we can't engage with you for your services because we can't do a qualification audit. And it's so important and so critical to us to move forward. We have to go do that. But oh, by the way, we're going to outsource it to a third party, and none of us are actually going to show up or be involved in the process whatsoever. So it's so important. We're going to outsource it to someone we've never met before, and they're going to come in and guess what? You know, we've never not passed a qualification audit, you know, and I can name most of the technology companies. Or someone was telling me how they really absolutely had to go, you know, evaluate this company. And I said, this company works with 50 of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. It has 200 other customers, but you're telling me that you need to go check this to make sure it's correct? I think that's kind of insanity.
Peter, I thought that was our secret. Come on.
Yeah.
These are the barriers that we self-impose. There's no regulatory requirement to do that. We self-impose it out of fear, out of protectionism for our organization, fearing that something new and different is going to create harm. And in today's environment, the harm is now starting to emerge that it's greater from the lack of action. And this is an interesting pivoting moment for many of our organizations. In the past, we were protected by not moving. Today, we're left behind and become obsolete.
I'm naturally a skeptic, and I can remember, I think it was 13 years ago, a discussion about RBM, and one of the sponsors saying I refused to use RBM in my trial, yet other people had been using it for 10 years prior to that, and they're like, I'm not going to be the first at anything. I'm going to wait till 9 other companies submit their trial to the FDA before I'll adopt anything whatsoever. And so, and again, having seen the slow adoption of so many things, I've been a skeptic, but I am a believer. We're going forward. We're not going back, and I'm excited by some of the outcomes. I mean, it was certainly interesting and not a year that I would wish upon us again. But I'm encouraged by. I really think this is going to make a lasting difference. And want any other comments from our panel?
There's nowhere to go but up. That would be my last comment.
I agree.
I want to thank you all for absolutely engaging dialogue. Very special thank you to our guest speakers for taking the time to join us, and thank you to all of the people who participated to listen. It's clear there's no going back and there's no need to, so we are going forward. It's not simple, but we will find the right successful collaborative partnerships with the right knowledge, skills, and dedication to adopting new technologies and move forward. The session recording will be emailed to all of the attendees in the next 48 hours. And look forward to hosting all of you again. And we're certainly looking for other topics you'd like to hear about, or other speakers or things. So again, Lori, Domingo, Greg, thank you. Thank you very much for participating.
You're welcome.
Thank
Thanks
you
for getting us together.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about how Worldwide Clinical Trials can support your upcoming trial, please contact us at worldwide.com.